Welcome to BYJU'S IAS. We are back here again with another edition of the weekly review of international affairs. And what an interesting week this has been. There have been developments, some expected, some unexpected, some anticipated, some sudden in different continents, which have a direct bearing on restructuring of the architecture of the post-COVID world and also a very likely significant impact on India's foreign relations. So we shall try to cover them, specially curated manner like we always do, to meet the requirements of all those candidates who are preparing for civil service examinations. And the events which we wish to cover are the rebirth and resurgence of the Islamic militants in different continents. We also would like to have a close look at the restructuring of the geopolitical map of the Middle East, and both of them intermesh into each other. And also they involved the big power interests, American foreign policy imperatives, China's interest in this region, and obviously how it is going to affect the fight against religious fundamentalism, international terror all over the world. So what are we waiting for? Here we go again. It was not very long ago that the world had thought that they had defeated the Islamic bloodthirsty jihadists who went by the name of the Islamic Caliphate, which came by the name of the Sheikh, or Islamic Sultanate of Iraq and Syria, or Islamic Sultanate of Iraq and Levant. But whatever might be the cause for satisfaction then, it is quite apparent after the bloody bloodbath in Mozambique in recent days that these hopes were misplaced. What happened in Mozambique, we must begin with the events which took place in Mozambique. In the northern corner of Mozambique, in a province called Cabo Delgado, there is a very, very massive project being developed which is worth billions of dollars. And the first phase is $6 billion to develop a plant of a liquid petroleum gas. And also there is a very important port opening out to the Indian Ocean in this region. The border is very close to Tanzania, the border joins Zimbabwe, the border is very close to South Africa. So this Mozambique has a very crucial geopolitical situation. And what happened was, where this in an area called Alfungi, this massive petroleum gas plant is being developed worth billions of dollars. Two important European companies are involved, one European, one American. Total is a French company, and Exxon has a very vital interest in the development of this gas plant also. What has happened is that there is an Al-Shabaab group. Now this Al-Shabaab group is no relation to the Al-Shabaab group. It is not a branch of the Al-Shabaab active in Somalia, in Mogadishu, but they have some affinities, both claim to be affiliates of the Islamic Sultanate of Southwestern Africa in this region. Now since 2015-16, they have been mounting attacks on civilians and army soldiers to carve out a territory of their own influence and throw out the government, which they think is not Islamic enough, the government is not efficient enough, it is not honest enough, and so on. We shall take into account all these things. But what happened in Mozambique was something very, very frightening. They almost destroyed a small town, a settlement called Palmas, where there was a hotel, there were some quarters of people who were working in these plants in Alfungi, and they, in a very well-planned, meticulous attack, razed the town to dust. They burnt houses, they killed hundreds of people, they beheaded some people, and they made it impossible for the people who had taken refuge in this hotel called Altura, where the people working in the gas plants were taking shelter, they used to live. And the plans to rescue them misfired very badly. And in recent past, what has happened is this Al-Shabaab group has killed thousands of people and also rendered almost 500,000 people refugees, because people persecuted by them have been drawing into these townships like Palmas. Some tried to avoid them, escape to the bush, but those who had taken shelter or refuge in the hotel were trapped. And the plans to evacuate them did not quite succeed. The rebels, the insurgents, call them whoever you may, are very well trained people. Some of them have been, it is said, been trained abroad in this kind of an operation. And the army of Mozambique doesn't have the morale or the inclination to take on these insurgents. They would like to keep away from overt military clashes as far as they can. There was a private security company operating out of South Africa which had taken the contract to protect the gas installations and the employees working there. The immediate cause of provocation was, it was said that the Total company had said that in past it had succumbed to the threats of the Al-Shabaab group and stopped production, stopped work on the production is far away on this plant. And this time they said that the situation has improved. In the next few days they might resume their work. So to stop them from the company from resuming the work, some people suggest that this attack was mounted. There are other military analysts who believe that the provocation was not the resumption of the work on this plant. They think that the Al-Shabaab group has been planning to destabilize the government for a long time, and this operation had been planned for quite some time, and it just coincided with the announcement of the Total company that they were resuming work. Security company, which had taken contract to protect these people, miscalculated the nature of the threat. The insurgents came with mortars, with machine guns, laid a siege along the hotel, and the poor people in the hotel tried to put painted stones in an SOS formation, hoping that the helicopters would land and rescue them. It was earlier announced that the helicopters would evacuate these people. There were boats which was believed to be ready by the beach, and they would be transported there and whisked out. Nothing succeeded. The helicopters were attacked. They were small helicopters. They could not be very heavily armed, although there was an armed helicopter escort provided for this rescue operation, but they had to withdraw. Their fuel was running low. The boats were not allowed to come near the beach, and ultimately some people tried to flee. They were caught and killed. Some other people thought that they would be saved by a convoy of four-wheel motor vehicles, escorted by motor vehicles, but the moment they came out of the hotel, they were ambushed. Some people were killed, and out of 17 of these motor vehicles, only 7 managed to break the barricades and run through the ambushes. Even these 7 had 7 people killed, several more were injured. Nobody knows exactly how many of these people were killed, how many were missing. Some people have been identified. There is a great mystery surrounding the fate of the others. The net result of this is that people have been made to rethink that the threat of the Islamic jihadists, they go by several names. It is in Niger, in Nigeria, in Malawi, in Mali, in Chad. They might go by the name of Boko Haram. They might go by the name of Islamic Sultanate of Northwestern Africa. They might go Islamic Sultanate of Central Africa, Islamic Sultanate of Southern Africa. But these groups are not necessarily parts of the same body. They carry the similar sounding names. They rearrange themselves. They operate across porous boundaries of different African nations, and the only thing common is that they have been trained in Africa and outside Africa by groups which belonged at one stage to Al-Qaeda. They also have Al-Qaeda supporters in Africa, but whatever name they go by, they ultimately trace their origins to the group Al-Qaeda, which was declared as an enemy number 1 by United States of America, which led to regime changes in various countries like Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. But when Americans declared that they had defeated the Islamic Sultanate, the Caliphate of Baghdadi, they were lulled into a false sense of security. These people regrouped themselves in different places and have been playing havoc. Now the point is not that it is it really an Islam versus Christianity, West Asia and Arabs versus the Europeans and the Americans conflict, or are there deeper roots? So the Mozambique issue makes us realize that should we not start examining the origins and roots of this kind of a crisis? Everywhere poverty is endemic. Everywhere there is misgovernance, everywhere there is a reluctance of the armed forces to take on insurgents. In some cases, because the government has not paid armed forces their wages in time, they have not been trained, they have not been equipped very well. The other more interesting question is that the sources of this kind of the conflict are A, rooted in endemic poverty, B, they are pre-existing, pre-colonial intra-tribal conflicts, inter-tribal conflicts, which lead to these feuds. What is worse, some time ago people said that there were conscripts in these Islamic jihadist groups. Young soldiers, barely adolescent, were forced to join them. But now the available evidence shows that some people join these groups voluntarily because they think that the only hope for them in a country which is going downhill, their own country downhill, it may be Mozambique, it may be Malawi, it may be Chad, it might be Mali, it might be Burkina Faso, it might be Niger, and there is a great economic disparity. It is not only endemic poverty, there are glaring gaps between the super rich, the politicians, the army generals, and the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak. So they have no health facilities, no educational facilities. They almost undergo food shortages and famines. They are reeling under the impact of the pandemic of corona. But for them, it is a question of do or die, snatch guns, attack people and loot whatever they can do. This brigandage is a profitable business for some youngsters between the ages of 20 to 30 plus. The other interesting thing is that everywhere there has been a revolution of rising expectations. Like in Mozambique, if you say that there is a $6 billion project going there for gas or petroleum, so people immediately think that this $6 billion would be filtered down to them, they would get livelihood, they would get employment, they would start getting a benefit immediately. Nobody has the patience to realize that this project would take 4 or 5 years before it comes to fruition. This is something which they don't foresee. And the government has failed to communicate to this that the employment which will be generated in the first phase would be for a limited number of people. There will be a lot more expatriates, a lot more specialized labor which will be required to come here. And this is what has been a major communications failure. The other thing is that if the neighbors want to help, if the South Africans want to send their military to help out a neighbor, or if there is, as we said, a private security agency is there, or if the companies which are involved have a national identification like the Total company and the French, they want to protect their investments, this intervention would be seen as a neo-colonialist intervention. The same thing applies to Congo. The countries are not intrinsically poor. They are rich in natural resources. But their natural resources have been controlled by multinational corporations, and there is an argument that this neo-colonialist, neo-imperialist nature of the exploitation of the resources of African countries makes a clear-cut divide which gives it some kind of a revolutionary fervor, some kind of an idealistic martyrdom syndrome to the people who take up arms and want to remedy the situation. Now what has happened is that in the meantime, in the southern Turkey, the Kurds have taken on the ISIL people whom they call are the sleeping cells in the refugee camps. Now what happens is that the refugees were not to begin with the ISIL sympathizers all. There is also a Shia-Sunni divide there. So there is the Islamic group in Africa which calls itself Nasrul Sunnah, the protectors of tradition, and the tradition in this case, there is a conflict of civilization situation, anti-Western, anti-Christian, pro-Islamic, pro-Muslim, but unfortunately the refugees living in a camp have no hope of a better life unless they think that the only hope is religion and Allah, and they are recruited, politicized by the Islamic extremists. So the Turkish Kurds went into the camps where people who had once stayed under the Caliphate IAS were there, and they singled out and they claimed to have killed some of the top leaders who were recruiting sleeping cells in these parts. But there is something like this which cannot ever be totally eliminated. And the European countries are learning from Britain to France to Germany that when hundreds and thousands of refugees come who are displaced from Syria or Iraq or other Islamic nations, they bring with them resentments, they bring with them separate identities, and when they are profiled as security threats in these countries and they are looked down on and they don't have human rights protection all the time, there is a mounting pile of grievances which takes place. They don't help their cause themselves by not giving up their traditional way of life, insisting on having either a hijab or having mosques and madrasas and so on. So we have talked about this resistance in Europe, in France, Germany, in northern European countries already, including United Kingdom. But the resurgence of ISIL on the African continent is the most dangerous portent for future, because a cordon sanitaire can be imposed against Africa, but you can't keep the virus out like you can't keep the coronavirus out, because the world has to trade, the world has to extract these natural resources, rare minerals, diamonds, gold, oil, petroleum gas, and to use their ports. And let's not forget that the Chinese are also eyeing the African continent as an area of their exclusive control. This is something which the West cannot neglect, because the American companies, the French companies, as we discussed, are involved here. Exxon is involved in Mozambique and elsewhere. And France already has this problem of trying to maintain law and order in south of Sahara, in Sahel countries, erstwhile colonies. And then we have to worry about how does India cope with countries with which it has traditionally had close economic and strategic ties, whether it is South Africa, whether it's the countries on the east coast of Africa, and India has in recent past tried to forge a closer relationship with Nigeria and other countries in the northwestern tip of Africa. So we have to look at these developments very, very carefully. There have been some very distressing and disturbing developments in the Middle East in West Asian region. Again, not long ago it was thought that the geopolitical map of the region was being redrawn and hopefully peace would return. There were two reasons to believe this. Saudi Arab and United Arab Emirates both had agreed upon normalizing their relationship with Israel. There was much hype trip of Israeli tourists which came to the Gulf countries. The Saudi Arab had tried to follow a moderate policy and introduce some reforms under Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as he is known as the Crown Prince. And everybody thought that this reduction of tension between Israel and the Gulf countries and the Saudi Arabs would lead to normalization of politics in this region. A very interesting feature of this development was that the Saudis and the UAE were worried about increasing Iranian influence in this region. Iranians were backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen. We'll talk about that a little later. It is a separate complex issue. And the Houthis, backed by Iranians, were emboldened to launch missile attacks on Saudi Arab installations. The Saudis had intervened under Mohammed bin Salman in the Yemeni civil war, and the Crown Prince had then thought that he would crush the rebels very easily. But over the past 5-6 years, the Yemeni rebels, the Houthis, who are Shias, there are shades of a Shia-Sunni conflict here, have steadily gained ground. Now this is surprising because the Saudis are far richer than the Houthis. They are impoverished, they are poor, and they are almost verging on greatest humanitarian tragedy in the world, as has been said by the Secretary General of the UN. Malnutrition is endemic. Several people are living on the verge of famine. There is terrible infant mortality rate. But the interesting part is that despite all this, they have managed to gain ground. So something has gone wrong with the Saudi military strategy in Yemen civil war. Saudis realize that they can't win this war anymore. So they have offered an olive branch to the Yemenis recently, Yemeni rebel Saudis, and said that we are willing in the spirit of goodwill to call for a ceasefire. But the Houthis refuse to give any ground or accept this offer because they are winning the war on the ground. They are almost on the verge of laying a siege to Marib, a very large town which is very close to the oil installations and so on, oil fields, and control it. Now, they are in a position already to attack the southern part of Saudi Arabia with impunity. So why should they make a compromise? And they realize that although on the map a large chunk of territory is controlled by the Republican government of Yemen, but the president has not been allowed to function from Yemen at all. He is in exile in Saudi Arabia and holds the government in exile there and tries to claim that he is the legitimate head of the government. Now, what this happens is, and in recent past, Iran has been slowly drifting towards China. This is also causing concern, and everybody was hoping that the elections in Israel would bring about some kind of a stability in Israel, but that has not happened. The elections, forced to be held in 2 calendar years, did not result in a decisive win, although Benjamin Netanyahu got the largest number of seats, but not a clear majority. Now, the role of the kingmaker has fallen to a small party which has not won too many seats, but it can throw its weight on side of either party, a pro-Benjamin Netanyahu coalition or an anti-Benjamin Netanyahu coalition. These kingmakers are the Palestinian Arabs who have chosen to stay on in Israel all along. So they were discriminated against, they were supposed to be traitors by the Palestinians, but right now they are in a position to be kingmakers. At the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu has yet to face the corruption charges, and the Israelis are no longer having a support of somebody like President Donald Trump in White House who would back them through and through without any reservation. Also, the UAE and Saudis realized that the deal which was brokered between Israel and the Gulf countries was by Kushner, the son-in-law of Trump. He is no longer there. Trump had declared the Houthi rebels as international terrorists. Now, Biden, one of the first things he did was to withdraw this designation of terrorists from Houthis, although he has named a few Houthi leaders as terrorists, but not the whole Houthis are no longer branded as international terrorists. So the Saudis and the Gulf countries realize that they are on a defensive. They are losing the war in Yemen. They are not in a position to take on the challenge of Iran. Elsewhere, Iranian militias held by Lebanon, Hezbollah thing, are very active in Syria. They are very influential elsewhere in this region. So Iran has not buckled down under the pressure that the Americans have not withdrawn the sanctions. They have survived the sanctions. And in the meantime, they have armed the Houthis enough to be reasonable threat to the Saudis. So this whole change of picture again poses challenges for India. The Indian Prime Minister had cultivated the Saudis very laboriously, very successfully. He was very popular in the UAE also. He was awarded the highest civilian honors there. So wherever he went, he made new friends. But if the friends he made suddenly find themselves, if not on the losing side of the strategic battle, but at least on the defensive, and they have not been able to reciprocate in recent times thanks to the price control mechanisms of the OPEC, or some blockage of the Suez Canal, or the war going against them in the Yemeni civil war. They have not been able to make good the promises or potential of the supply of fuel to India when it needed most. So obviously the Indians have looked for other sources of fuel energy security. Now once this is restructured, the Saudis and UAE will fall in the priority of Indians as fuel suppliers. We have of course opted out of the Iranian fuel supply, but the point is the Middle East oil might be tricky for us. So it's not only the oil prices, it is also the large number of Indian diaspora working in this region. So Indians have to worry about their economic security, their human rights and so on, and this is going to be a problem area. Now, the other thing was that people thought that once this restructuring of the geopolitical map would take place, Turkey would be almost balanced. So Turkey had megalomaniac ambitions. It was trying to spread itself from Libya to Greece to Caucasus. But recently two things have happened which have again put Turkey on the defensive. One was Erdogan sacking his chairman of the central bank, and immediately there was a sudden decline of the lira, devaluation, and an economic crisis looms large for Turkey. He may at the moment have total control and support of the army, but he also is following a pro-Islamic line which is going to bring him into conflict. He is much too authoritarian a leader. He has conveyed to the Americans that he would go ahead with the S-400 deal. Is the deal done of the missiles which he has bought from Soviet Union? He has got some kind of a modus vivendi with Putin about Azerbaijan and Armenia. But the problem is he also offered some kind of an olive branch to Greece and to Egypt, but they again, nobody knows how serious he is. The other part is that he has got domestic dissidents against him increasing. Recently, Turkey abrogated a law which provided security to the women against domestic violence. Turkey is called the Istanbul Agreement. It was in a major city in Turkey where this was agreed upon, and if Turkey withdraws out of this, it is reneging on an international treaty, and it says no, it is against our culture and we will not do that. People have estimated that almost 3,000 women lose their lives in domestic violence, either killed by their husbands or in-laws, and people don't condemn this. So can Turkey remain in medieval era in terms of social legislation? Can it remain in modern era at the same time, in high technology, in weaponry and so on? The question is, can it, Turkey, survive as a major power in the region with memories of its imperial past, while domestically it is constantly besieged by opposition, by dissidents, and weakening itself by feudal patriarchal legislation? This is one part. There are issue of minorities, the Kurds. There also is the Shia-Sunni divide, which does affect Turkey to a certain extent. So this whole cauldron, Saudi Arabia, UAE, civil war in Yemen, Turkey, Iran, is causing a great consternation in international politics. Another crisis which seems to be snowballing from day to day is in the immediate neighborhood of India, in Myanmar. By now, within 2 months, the army has trying to crush the peaceful demonstrations against it, protesting against the arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi and not letting her party to form the government after a massive victory in the elections, has taken a very brutal turn. By now, 450 people have been killed. more than 120 people in a single day, and they have been killed in a brutal manner which has shocked the conscience of the world. Young kids, 1-year-old have been killed, 3, 4, 5-year-old girls have been killed, people sitting in their houses have been killed, and the army, it is quite clear, has given instructions to shoot, to kill. Snipers have been posted which shoot people in the head or in the back. When they go out with their dear ones for the funeral, their funeral processions are attacked. Now what is happening is that the Myanmarese government and the army insist that people who have taken out these protests are enemies of the nation. Earlier it was said they are misguided, but now they say they are traitors, they are misguided. But by and large, one cannot overlook that the protests have been peaceful and the peaceful protesters have been set upon. Now, the speculations are twofold. Why is the army doing this? In 1988, when they had killed about 3,000 people and suppressed the protests, can they do the same? They are heading very much in that direction, and some people argue that the soldiers have been brainwashed. They really think that they are fighting against traitors, but it is difficult to believe that any soldier in his right state of mind can shoot a 1-year-old kid and say that this is the enemy of the nation, or a 3-year-old girl, or a school child, or fire at the funeral procession. So I don't think that this argument quite holds water. It may also be a threat in future that if the younger generation of the Myanmaris continue with their protests, don't give up, what would happen is that there might be a split in the army ranks, if not in the top leadership. Even in the top leadership, somebody might say that the present leadership has failed to protect the interests of the army itself. Army's economic interests, the vested interests of the generals, the economic conglomerates, and the foreign companies which are there, including Chinese companies, have come out with guarded statements that we are friends of Burma, we are friends of Myanmarese government, we are friends of Burmese people. We would like both sides to settle their differences amicably. What is disgusting is that the whole world is watching and at times condemning what is happening in Myanmar, but has taken no concrete steps. Now, what does this lead us to conclude? It leads us to conclude that rise of authoritarian governments or military tyranny or corruption of an authoritarian regime makes no difference to international politics at the moment. Obviously, the trading partner, the most important trading partner and the supporter in UN for Myanmar is China. China itself is accused of being an authoritarian state which has violated the human rights of the Tibetans, of the Muslims, Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, has stifled the democratic movement in Hong Kong. So it can be argued that as long as one major authoritarian regime supports a smaller authoritarian regime, the rest of the world cannot meaningfully make an intervention, humanitarian or otherwise. You can make pious declarations that a state has a primary duty to protect its citizen, protect human rights, protect constitutional rights, etc. The second thing is the immediate neighborhood of Myanmar. If you see, Bangladesh doesn't brook much opposition. Sheikh Hasina is a popular leader, charismatic leader, but there is no other opposition party. And there have been accusations of authoritarianism in Bangladesh as well. Come a little further, you have Malaysia, which started off as a liberal democracy, but in recent past it has drifted towards Islamic form of governance. Tolerance of criticism, dissidence is stopped, political opponents are systematically persecuted and hounded, and they keep quiet. Take the other ASEAN countries, which could have had a say in Myanmar, which are important trading partners. Indonesia is again not an ideal pluralistic democracy. Thailand is a thinly disguised military dictatorship which uses the monarchy as a front to legitimize its role, and actually the three-fingered salute which the Burmese Myanmar youth and the Myanmarese citizens show was borrowed from Thailand. Now we don't even know how many Myanmaris are trying to flee across the border and take refuge in Thailand. Some have come to Mizoram and Indian states, some, the Rohingyas and others, have gone to Bangladesh, but then you see Cambodia is again a very authoritarian regime, now also getting an authoritarian communist dynastic succession also. You have Brunei, which is an Islamic Sultanate, which is not a democratic republic or whatever. You have Duterte in Philippines, which is an authoritarian ruler. So you take the immediate context of the whole Southeast Asian region and ASEAN neighbors, there is hardly a regime which can claim to be non-authoritarian. Now there may be a benevolent regime like the Singapore, but which again is a one-party state for more than half a century. It doesn't have a very open mind about freedom of expression. It claims to be all that. It is a very efficient government. It is not a corrupt government, but authoritarianism is very much there. So nobody is going, including India, risk its real political protection of national interests by criticizing Myanmar military junta openly. But the issue is that how long can you remain silent when you see gross violation of human rights next door? This is the kind of mistake India made when Aung San Suu Kyi was fighting a non-violent struggle against the military junta 10-15 years ago, when she was awarded a Nobel Prize after that. Right now, if we alienate ourselves from the younger generation of Myanmar, don't even criticize, it would not reflect very well for a democracy which is supposed to be the largest democracy in the world, pluralistic democracy in the world. At the same time, the fact remains that we have vital security interests in Myanmar, which we think are being protected by the military rulers. At the same time, we cannot forget that in near future the protests may no longer remain peaceful. The ethnic minorities might take up arms. Myanmarese government has bombarded the southern part of Myanmar, bordering Thai border, where Karens have a liberation army. But if this happens, we have a formula for a civil war in the immediate neighborhood, which certainly is not very welcome sign. That is all we have for you this week. We shall come back again next week with more of this, but I think you ponder over the three things which we have discussed here. These are not isolated incidents of Islamic violence, terrorism in Mozambique, but it is the major issue of the resurgence, rebirth and revival of suicidal Islamic jihadi terror, which may not necessarily be entirely rooted in the confrontationist attitude of Islam. It might have, the real roots might be endemic poverty, tribalism, the gap between the rich and the poor, misgovernance, corruption, and the army taking sides in a tribal warfare of sorts. And more important than anything else, the multinational corporations and the foreign countries trying to exploit the natural resources of countries in Africa, which are called poor countries. They are rich in natural resources, but they have been impoverished by foreign countries, colonizers, or multinational companies. Similarly, when we come to the potential or promise of peace in Middle East and West Asia, let us not forget that what appears hopeful at a moment might be undone by unexpected developments like the election results in Israel, the election results in the United States of America, or the intransigence of the Iranians to back out, blink in face of economic sanctions, and also the failure of the Saudis to bring the civil war to Yemen to a quick end, and in the process celebrating a human tragedy which is unfolding there. So and all these areas are of geopolitical importance, areas where India has an interest in terms of fuel security, Indian diaspora, Indian labor. So we have to watch these developments very, very carefully, whether it is Turkey, whether it is Iran versus Saudi Arabia, whether it is Israel, with which country we have developed close ties, including our weapons deals in recent past. So we have to balance our interest very, very delicately in this region. At the same time, when we talk of Myanmar, it is not only one country we are worried about authoritarianism. If the general trend in the world, and just before Biden became the President of the United States of America, Trump's government was as authoritarian as you could have at anywhere else. The analysts of international relations would say that Russian government under Putin is as authoritarian as it can be. Some people would argue that even Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom is as authoritarian as he can be. And the postures adopted by French President Macron appear to many as very authoritarian. From day one, when he sacked the general who was at the head of the armed forces to assert who was the superior one, the way he has been playing musical chairs with his prime ministers. So all that is apart. So we have to keep in mind what is happening in ASEAN. We have to keep in mind what is happening in the larger context elsewhere in the world. This is not to defend and justify authoritarianism. Some countries would even argue that India has drifted from democracy to authoritarianism. So we have to carefully keep this in mind. There have been international reports we have discussed in past which say India is no longer a full democracy but a partial democracy. But all these issues will recur in our review of international relations again and again. Till we meet again, thank you and goodbye.